You're doing a round of muting would really help.
The audio is from Cheryl's side.
Yeah, the noise is coming from here. We've got somebody, yeah, we're trying to.
There is one audience member who's unmuted.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our the latest class in our virtual course on data and macro development. Today we're going to be talking about gender data, and we're very happy to have Cheryl Doss with us from Tufts University. Just like in previous lectures, we'll do a 1-hour lecture and we'll do some Q&A at the end. And I see some familiar faces and some new faces in the front row. If you're in the front row, you can type your questions right into the chat. You can just address everybody. If you want to do them privately to me, I can, that's okay too, but you might as well ask everybody. And if you're in the audience, but not in the front row, there's the Q&A, and we will be checking that in real time, and our answer may well be, good question. Let's ask Cheryl at the end. So feel free to ask questions at any time. You can just type them right in. So today's class is going to be about gender data, and Cheryl's a world leader on this topic, and the topic, as in the previous lecture, is going to be geared towards macroeconomists who are interested in these topics and maybe could use some guidance on where the best data sources are for your research on these questions. So Cheryl, thanks so much for agreeing to give this lecture. If you want to share your slides and get started, that would be terrific.
So are you seeing the slides?
Seeing them, but not full screen yet.
What do I need to do?
Control L.
There we go. Great. Well, I'm really delighted to be here and to get to talk to you all about gender data. So let me just start by asking the question, what is gender data? What do we mean by this? And today what I'm going to talk about is really two different pieces of it. The first is thinking about gender disaggregated data. So it's data where we can identify the sex of the person that we're interested in. And then secondly, thinking about data about gender equality. And so what kind of data is available to look at those kinds of questions as well. So I'm going to first talk about some of the data sources, types of data that we might be interested in, and then what the sources of that data are. So thinking first about national level indicators on gender, focusing on social institutions, then on aggregates at the national level that of individual level data. So places where they've aggregated it up already. And then thinking about individual level data from household surveys. And then I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about how to measure some of these things that often come up in the literature when we're trying to think about gender, and how we might measure elements of either bargaining power or empowerment, thinking about asset ownership, sexual harassment and gender-based violence, decision-making, and then some of the new indices that have been developed on women's empowerment. So first, let me just say a little bit about these national level indicators on gender. So these are typically data that come, that different sources have put together where they've done an analysis of documents, such as legal frameworks, to provide some kinds of measures on discrimination, legal frameworks, or other kinds of social institutions. Some of them are aggregated up from individual level data, but these sources have actually put the data together into particular indices that you can just plug in sometimes, if you know what you're doing and what they're for. Some of them can be disaggregated, so they take several different kinds of indicators and add them up together. So we'll go through what some of those are. So the first source for this kind of data is the Women Business in the Law database. The first round of this, the Women Business in the Law 1.0, has annual data for 190 countries from 1971 to 2024. And they have data on 8 different areas. So looking at laws around, for example, laws affecting women's decisions to work. So what laws around the workplace, laws around marriage, and thinking about what the legal constraints are within marriage. Do wives have the same rights within marriage as their husbands? And a whole range of these. They've now, starting in 2024, added another set of indicators. So down at the bottom, you can see the new ones that they have. And so they've not only got information on the legal frameworks that's nicely collated that you can pull together, but also now information on what they're calling the supportive frameworks. So thinking about what the public policy instruments are. And then also they now have expert opinions. And so it's not just the legal framework, but also things like, are the laws actually enforced? What actually happens in practice for some of these kinds of things. So a great resource on legal frameworks. The Social Institutions and Gender Index, SIGI, is measuring discrimination against women in social institutions. They have data on 179 countries, and they look at 4 dimensions. So really thinking about discrimination. So discrimination within the family, whether women have restricted physical integrity, whether there's restricted access to productive and financial resources, and restricted civil liberties. And let me just give you an example of the kinds of things, the individual pieces that go into the indicator on restricted physical integrity. So that's about laws about violence against women, women's acceptance of whether they say intimate partner violence is acceptable, the prevalence of intimate partner violence, so a range of things around this. Laws, acceptance, and prevalence, again, of female genital mutilation, sex ratios at birth, which captures whether girls are being aborted or, and so you get a different sex ratio, laws on reproductive autonomy and unmet need for family planning. So for all of these, if you're interested in national level measures, you can use the aggregates, or you can look at some of the smaller pieces of it, whichever is most useful for the kinds of questions that you're looking at. There's an index called the Gender Inequality Index. I don't think this one is quite as useful as some of the others, but they have indicators on health, empowerment, and labor market for both men and women. So putting those together into a gender inequality index. Again, one measure at the national level is what they do. The Gender Social Norms Index, the United Nations Development Program has taken data from the World Values Survey that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes and put together an index capturing attitudes about women's roles along 4 dimensions about political, educational, economic, and physical integrity. So not measuring the laws, but actually measuring people's attitudes and the social norms. So those are kind of the main data sources that I would think of as being good data sources for national level indicators on these kind of social institutions and the laws. The World Development Indicators aggregate available data and make it easy to use. Much of what they do is aggregating up from survey data, but giving national level data on things like life expectancy at birth by sex, or health and education measures by sex. So that's just a simple way to get the national level indicators on some of these. If you want to go beyond the national level indicators, then I think more and more macroeconomists are starting to think about how to use micro level data and survey data. Now, I know there's already been lectures on survey data generally. So what I'm going to try to do is try to convey the things that you really need to think about when you're using survey data if you're interested in gender kinds of questions. So many household surveys have a household roster with all the members on it, with all the information about them, including their gender. And so then that can be matched up to the individuals within the survey with information about education, health, labor, employment on those. Some surveys have information on other kinds of things within the household, like who owns the assets. So you would know if it's men or women, who makes decisions, these kinds of things. The nice thing about these surveys is that typically you can not only disaggregate and look at gender, but you can also think about other demographic characteristics as well, like age and marital status and education. So then you can put together measures that are relevant for what you're doing. So you could do it kind of an intersectional approach where you look by gender and age or gender and race. You could also think about aggregating up to regional levels or other kinds of household levels. So you could think about women and men who are living in households below the poverty line, or thinking about comparisons of rural men and women. So the survey data gives you, it's the underpinnings of what some of those national level measures do, but lets you do so much more with it. So what are the challenges with thinking about survey data across countries, particularly when we're thinking about gender? The questions in surveys may be constant across countries, and I'll try to point out some of them where they're that way, or they may have been adapted to the local context. And there's just always this tension between having data, particularly survey data, that's internationally comparable and that's locally relevant. And this may be particularly relevant for thinking about gender. So for example, some surveys will ask questions about land ownership and just call it land ownership wherever they are. But in some places, land can't be formally owned. It's owned by the state. So people have rights that look a lot like ownership, but they're not technically ownership. In other places, land may be held under customary tenure legally, and then plots are allocated to households to farm or to individuals to farm, but they don't own it per se. Or in other places, people may hold legal title to plots of land. In particular, the understanding of who owns land within the household may be based on gender. So particularly thinking about what joint ownership might mean is going to really vary across contexts. So it's nice to have lots of data sets that talk about land ownership, but you just need to be cognizant that sometimes what they actually mean by that and how people are interpreting that might be very different across countries. And again, a lot of these ways in which these things get interpreted really matter for gender analyses. You also want to think about questions about the sampling, who's sampled and whether the survey is nationally represented, but also who may be missed. So we're going to typically miss the very wealthy, miss those in conflict areas, pastoralists, internal migrants, people in informal settlements. And the sampling may be that they sample households or that they sample individuals. And so that may matter for gender as well, because if you're sampling individuals, you're much more likely to get equal numbers of men and women in households, sampling households. They may have had to really think about how to, who they're interviewing. And so you'll want to know what the approach was for these things. One thing to think about is who within the household is interviewed. This will matter a lot more for some questions than others, but often one person may provide information about each household member. So they'll interview one person and ask that one person about the education level of everybody in the household or the type of employment. This is sometimes called using a proxy respondent. Household surveys may also interview multiple people where each person responds about themselves. They may interview everybody in the household. That's not very common. It's more common that both spouses will be interviewed so that we'll have responses from men and women in the household. But often the people then who get missed would be in an intergenerational household, maybe the elderly, maybe the young families living in that household, the daughter-in-law, son and daughter-in-law, may be missing from those kinds of surveys. We really need responses from individuals and not proxies for some kinds of questions, particularly things about perceptions, attitudes, knowledge. You can't ask the household head or one person about what everybody else in the household thinks about something. Sometimes questions could be either asked about the household level or the individual level. So thinking about shocks, one of the things that we find is that they may ask whether the household, ask the household head if the household experienced a shock, and the household may say no, but there may be somebody who just recently joined the household. Maybe the daughter moved back home to the household because her husband died and she's now moved back in with her parents. And so if you asked her, she would say she'd experienced a shock, even if the household might not think that, right? So really just thinking in particular context about which kinds of things matter. I would just say that microeconomists are now asking questions sometimes about what we can learn from different responses from household members. So that's one of the things I've been working on is what do we do and what kind of information when husbands and wives give us different answers to the same kinds of questions. So let me talk a little bit about some of these surveys that are out there. One is the demographic and health surveys. Those get used quite a bit for gender analyses and coming up with measures related to gender. The focus is on health, particularly reproductive health, but there's questions typically for both men and women. Women's interviews are limited for the main women's questionnaire to women aged 15 to 49. So for some things, you really wouldn't want to use these because it might really be important to have data from women over 50. Some of the surveys will have modules. Some of the DHS have additional modules that include older women. And the nice thing, again, about the DHS is that the standardized questions across the surveys, they ask everybody the same thing. You just have to be careful because the meanings of what those and how people interpret those questions might really vary across countries. The World Values Survey, they have 7 waves of cross-section data in almost 100 countries. That's what they say. Actually, it's more like 80 to 90. And they ask people questions about their values. So they ask them questions about, I think they ask over 250 questions about cultural values, about their attitudes and beliefs about gender, about family, about religion. They ask them about their attitudes and experience of poverty, health, education, and security, a bunch of political kinds of questions, how they feel about multilateral institutions, about political trust, now climate change, and some of these things. So what you're really getting is information on how people view the world. The data everywhere is collected from both men and women. And again, the same questions are asked in every country. And there's some demographic information included on every respondent. So you know not only gender, but some other kinds of things about age and I think race as well. The Financial Inclusion Index, FINDEX, began in 2011. The latest round was in 2021. And these are nationally representative surveys in 123 countries. They collect data on access to and use of both formal and informal financial services and digital payments. And they have data from both men and women. They do a lot of analyses kind of identifying the gaps, gender gaps in both the access to and usage of financial services. And I would just add that much of the data that you'll see sometimes in some of these earlier national level indicators that I mentioned, for their kind of pieces on women's access to finance, they're actually coming back and using the FINDEX data. So this is really the data that gets used on financial inclusions to be able to look at gender issues. The Living Standards Measurement Study, the LSMS, I know Talib talked quite a bit about this when he gave his lecture. There's many multipurpose household surveys that have detailed information. Each country survey has questions that are adapted for use in the specific country. So it's not exactly the same questions everywhere, but you can often figure out how to put them together. Takes a little bit more work to put those together and try to come up with comparable measures for cross-country analyses. There's two other particular versions of them. The LSMS ISA, the Integrated Surveys on Agriculture, have information on just 8 countries in Africa, but very detailed agricultural modules. They are panel data, and a lot of the agricultural information is disaggregated by gender. So we know who owns the land, who's making the decisions, who's doing the labor in agriculture. And then the LSMS Plus, again, it's only 6 surveys, but they interview multiple members of the household, asking about asset ownership, employment, and entrepreneurship. So we have information from both men and women on their own understanding of asset ownership, employment, and entrepreneurship within the household. It's one of the places where you get different answers from different people in the same house about the same thing. Most countries collect labor force surveys. Again, you had a long lecture on labor force surveys and labor force data. They're collected typically at the individual level by individual countries. The issue to think about with these when you're thinking about gender issues is that in some cases, women who are working but are not working for pay tend not to identify themselves as working. This is particularly true for contributing family members. So those people who are working on family farms or in small businesses but are not getting paid. They're supposed to be included as workers and treated as working, but depending on how the labor force surveys are implemented in particular countries, that particular group of women may be underrepresented. Next week, you're going to get a lecture on time use surveys, and there's a lot of literature on gender and time use. Really interesting patterns of gender differences in how men and women use their time. Again, the two kind of gender things that are specifically about gender that you have to think about when using time use surveys is, again, women may not see what they're doing as work, and that the method of handling how people report multitasking is particularly relevant to understanding women's work, particularly how women are responding when they're doing both childcare and something else. That's true for men too, but in much of the world, that has a much bigger impact on the kind of data and how we think about the time use data. Lots of surveys will ask you about a primary activity and a secondary activity. So that's often where working in your shop and doing childcare will come in, but that often varies across countries, and not all the countries have primary data, have both primary activities and secondary activities. So you just need to be aware when you're using this data of how it was collected and how they're handling multitasking. Let me add another thing here. What we still see sometimes is people doing comparisons of male and female headed households when only household level data is available and we don't have anything that goes within the household. People will often use comparisons of male and female headed households. But this is really confounding household structure and gender. In particular, in most contexts, households are only defined as being female-headed if there's no adult men present, whereas most male-headed households include adult women. So comparing those two, it's not simply about the gender of the head, but it's actually about the whole household structure. So sometimes it could be really useful to compare households based on structure, but you want to go beyond just thinking about the headship. You might want to think about whether it's headed by a single adult, a man, a woman, or a couple. Latin America is now collecting much of their data, thinking about dual-headed households versus single-headed households. but also thinking about whether households are intergenerational. Might want to think of those as a separate category, or extended households that might be extended horizontally if you live with your husband's brother lives in a household as well, or polygamous kinds of households. But my basic suggestion on comparing male and female headed households is simply not to do it. That's not a good kind of gender analysis. So I want to talk next about, so those are the kinds of data that are available and kind of a sample of the data that's available. Obviously, there's lots and lots of other household survey data that's available. Lots of projects collect really rich, detailed data, may be useful. Often it's not nationally represented. It's just in a particular area, but can be useful for particular purposes. Sometimes it's collected in enough areas that you could extend up and think about more national level kinds of representation of it. But I want to think now a little bit about some of the particular variables that you might use, or how to think about them for measuring bargaining power and empowerment. So there's a really rich literature, more in the micro literature, but now starting to be in the macro literature, that thinks about the importance of women's bargaining power within the household, and how that might affect the outcome of household decisions. And then more recently, thinking about measures of women's empowerment, sometimes men's and women's empowerment, and how that affects a wide range of outcomes. I would just say, to start with, there is no consistent definition or usage of these terms. I was at a conference last fall where I saw 4 different papers talking about how women's bargaining power affected kind of gender-based violence, and everybody was using, they came up with really different answers, but everybody was using really different definitions and variables for what women's bargaining power was. So I would just really encourage people that if you're going to think about these concepts about bargaining power, to really clearly define how you're using the term and what your data you're using. And that often I think it's more useful, instead of maybe to frame it in the context of a bargaining framework, but then to actually talk about what those variables are that you're actually using to measure it. So I'm going to again talk about 3 areas that are particularly relevant to this: asset ownership, sexual harassment, and gender-based violence, and decision-making. And then I'll talk about some of these more specific indices of empowerment. So let me start with women's asset ownership. And they get used often as a measure of women's bargaining power, and they're also often a measure of, or a component of thinking about women's empowerment. And there's starting to be more and more data, some of these big data sets that actually have information at the individual level on ownership of assets, particularly land and particularly financial assets. So again, the Findex data has some of this. So I'm going to talk specifically about asset ownership in a little bit more detail, in part because a lot of the things to think about with the asset data is also relevant for thinking about some of the other ones. Okay. I'm getting my time information here. Okay. So if we think about asset ownership, let me step back a second to say that the asset data comes in 2 different forms. One is that a proxy respondent might say for the household, and I think this is what happens in much of the LSMS data, the one person who's being interviewed is asked, who owns the farm? Who owns this particular plot of land? And they give answers to it. They would list out the owners in that particular context. The other way is to ask, and they do this in the LSMS Plus, each person in the household whether they own any of a particular type of asset. So thinking about what you can do with that data, how do you put it together and think about some more kind of macro indicators? One is to think about the incidence of asset ownership. So thinking about the number of women who own out of the total number of women, so the share of women who own land or some other asset, and then you also have data on the number of men who are owners out of the total number of men. So this is really useful. This is for land. This is one of the SDG indicators, is the percentage of women who own land and the percentage of men who own land. And in this case, we're not thinking about whether they own it individually or they own it jointly. It's just whether or not that person is an owner of that type of asset. It doesn't tell us anything about how much they own, right? So I would claim to be an asset ownership, a landowner, whether I had a little teeny tiny plot or, you know, thousands of acres in my farm. I'm going to show you two slides on the incidence of land ownership from a project I worked on where we collected this data from the state of Karnataka in India, from Ecuador and Ghana. And what you see here is that the incidence of land ownership for women is about the same in all three countries, and it is fairly low. It's kind of 7 to 8%. So we look at these and think it's pretty similar across countries. But when you actually add in the data from men and men's asset ownership, the incidence of ownership for men, we see that the patterns are really different. And that the story in Ecuador is one of actual gender equality in terms of who owns land, but that not very many people own land. In Karnataka, a lot more people own land, but it's much, much more men than women. We could also think about the share of asset owners who are women. So if you're looking for a single indicator for a country or a region or a particular group, right, you can aggregate it up in whichever ways are useful. This compares women and men's ownership in one number. So the share of owners who are women. It doesn't, again, tell us anything about how widespread ownership is. So that we see in Ecuador, it's 50-50, but this number isn't going to tell us that actually not very many people own land. It does show us that in Karnataka, right, women are a very small share of the land owners. So another way to think about the asset ownership data is to think about the distribution of assets by the form of ownership. That's kind of a mouthful. So let me tell you what I'm thinking here. It's taking all of the assets. So we could think about it as the houses that people live in. That's nice because each person only has one that they live in or that they report on. And we look at that out of all of the assets, all of the residences that are owned, how many are owned by a woman? How many are owned by a man? How many are owned jointly by the couple? Or in our case, we just had another category as well. You could, in different contexts, you could think about different ways to think about joint, what's relevant in that particular context. The unit of analysis here is the asset. We're trying to think about how the asset is divided up across women who own it alone, men who own it alone, and people who own it jointly. And I've got in my formulas here the number of assets, but you could also think about it as the value of a particular type of assets, the area of land, whatever's appropriate for the asset that you're thinking about. And this provides a framework for helping to think about joint ownership, how much of it's jointly owned versus individually owned, and how the assets are owned. So here we get for the form of ownership by residence, for again, those same three countries, a really interesting pattern here, both in Ecuador and Ghana. We see that individual men are most likely to own the residence. Individual women own some of them, but particularly in Ecuador, we see that the principal couple, so the house that you live in is owned jointly with your spouse. That's a function of a lot of different things in Ecuador. Happy to talk about those later. But for here, just seeing that these patterns really differ. And in India, very, very few people report that the couple owns the assets, the residence jointly. Just another example on the same thing. This is using the LSMS ISA data for Uganda and looking at the distribution of household land by gender and ownership type. So the green is women, blue is men, purple is joint. The dark colors are for where, or the light colors are where the people who own it actually have some kind of document for it. A title, some kind of registration document. So we can look at this in an even broader way here, separating out both pieces, but seeing how much, and this is about the area of land. So it's capturing in this one, because it's area of land, the fact that typically, even when women own land in Uganda, they own much smaller portions of land than do the men, as you can see from the green. So let me just say what the takeaway messages are from this piece on asset ownership. First, to figure out which of these, I've just shown you several different measures. Really thinking about what is the research question you're trying to answer, and what do you need to know for that particular research question. I think for all the gender analysis, particularly when you're using the survey data, it's really important to have data on both men and women. Again, you can't see what the story is for women if you can't compare it with what's going on for men, as in the Ecuador residence case or land case. It's really useful in this example in particular to think about what the unit of analysis is. Are we looking at individuals and whether or not they own land, or the resident or the asset, or are we looking at the assets and trying to understand who owns them? And then for asset ownership, and this is going to be true for lots of other indicators, particularly decision-making, you get answers that are both, it's the man, it's the woman, or it's joint. And if you're not looking at the joint piece of it, you may be missing really important pieces of the story. So if you're just looking at whether men and women own land, in cases where women only ever own land jointly with their spouse, but men own land with their spouse and individually, that's going to not give you a very full picture of what's going on. But again, whether that's important or not will depend on the particular research question that you're asking. So let me say a little bit about sexual harassment and gender-based violence, because these are other things that, again, these often fit in to those earlier indicators, those national level indicators that I talked about. There are no good standard measures across countries for sexual harassment. Some countries have data, and I think more are starting to think about it, of experience within the workplace and also experiences of sexual harassment in public places. Almost all of the data on sexual harassment is on women, although in a few places, mostly in the global north, there's some information about harassment of non-binary people as well. For data on gender-based violence, there's some data available across countries. So there's the DHS has a module on intimate partner violence that many of the DHS surveys include. So this is violence that's perpetuated by one's spouse or intimate partner, it's not more general gender-based violence. There's much less consistent data on kind of more general gender-based violence, right? Whether people have experienced violence because they're a woman or specifically because they're a man or non-binary. So lots of issues around thinking about this kind of data. It can be really useful, and I know people really like to have it as a measure in understanding what's going on. I think it's probably an important explanation. Both the sexual harassment and some of the violence in the workplace is probably some of what's explaining women's lower workforce participation in some contexts. I just want to say there's a lot of ethical concerns with collecting this data. And so it's useful to think about those. If you're thinking about collecting this data on your own, you're doing some surveys on your own, you really need to talk to people who have thought about how to collect this data ethically. You could be by asking these kinds of questions, you could be putting the women respondents at risk. You could also be putting the enumerators at risk. You can also, there's concern about that if women have never ever talked about the violence that they've experienced, and you go in and start asking them, you're asking them to relive that experience when maybe they haven't ever processed it in that kind of way. There's also real concerns about the level of accuracy. So if you go and ask people about their experiences of gender-based violence, they may or may not be willing to talk to you about it. And we get really different understandings of what sexual harassment is. And so hard to know how whether you're getting accurate and kind of consistent measures of that. So if you're using that kind of data, you want to go back and really look at what they've done and try to understand how they collected that data and whether you think that was collected well enough that it's actually telling you something useful. The other way this data gets collected is by asking about attitudes, particularly about gender-based violence. So the DHS has, I think, about 5 questions on whether it's acceptable for a man to beat his wife under different scenarios. So is it okay for a man to beat his wife if she burns the food? Is it okay for him to beat his wife if she refuses to have sex with him? So it's not actually asking people if they've experienced this, but what their attitudes about it are. I think much of the work I've done, we felt like asking these, when I've been involved in collecting data, that this is a much safer and more ethical way to ask these kinds of questions, and that it tells us something important about the social norms around gender-based violence. The World Values Survey also has a couple of questions on attitudes about both it asks whether women should tolerate their husband beating them, and also whether this is appropriate for men. I think one of the questions is about whether it's a good way for men to get their wives to respect them, to see what people's attitudes are on that. So the attitudes data is more widely available, pretty consistently asked, and is probably better for to be particularly to think about putting in kind of more macro analysis, since the experience data isn't very good. Good in terms of high quality. There's also prevalence measures, and these aren't collected at the individual level, but they are collected to tell you about the prevalence of gender-based violence in a community. It can be aggregated up to countries. Again, some of those earlier measures I talked to had prevalence measures. They're collected in different kinds of ways. Sometimes it's by using these survey questions on the experiences that people have had. Some of them are using police reports, which we know provides a very, very low bound on people's experience of sexual violence. Many people don't report it, but it does give some kind of a lower bound. And then the other way that's often done is the list methodology, which has much fewer ethical concerns about it. You divide your sample in half, and in group 1, you give them, for example, a list of 4 items and ask them, how many of these things have you ever experienced? Have you ridden in a public bus? Have you, they can be anything, but kind of things that some, but not all people in your sample would have experienced. You need there to be some variation across the group. 2 gets the same list of 4, but a question about gender-based violence. And all you're asking them is how many of these they've experienced. So it's a way to back out from group 2, comparing group 2 with group 1. In that population, how many people have experienced gender-based violence? And so that's fairly widely used to get these prevalence kinds of measures. Again, you can't connect it to anything else about those people because you don't actually know in the survey which people have actually experienced it, but it does give those prevalence kinds of measures. The other set of kind of variables that often get used in gender analysis are thinking about questions, survey questions about decision making. These often get asked to women. The DHS asks women about their involvement in decision making in a range of things. Things like large household expenditures and small household expenditures, and whether they can travel on their own. So thinking about some of those kinds of decisions. And these are often used as a proxy for women's empowerment, with the notion that women who make more decisions are more empowered. There's a number of ways that these questions get asked. So they get asked, who makes the decisions? They might ask, how much input do you have in the decision? They might ask, who has the final say on these? And these give you really different answers. So when people have compared across these different ways that the questions are asked in the same survey, you get different answers. So you can't really say, oh, I've got kind of this question in one country or in one area, but a different one, and think that they're telling you the same thing. You need those to be consistent across country, or the same kind of question being asked. When there's a range of these, you can think about aggregating using just one of them. So I have a paper where we just looked, they were all so highly correlated that we decided to just simply look at women's involvement in making decisions on large household expenditures, and thought that was a pretty good proxy for what we were doing for understanding women's voice within the household. Or you can aggregate up across the decisions, and then the question kind of comes, do you weight them equally? Do you think about making decisions about expenditures, large expenditures and small expenditures? Do you weight those evenly and adding them up? And then the other question is about thinking a little bit about what a good level of decision-making is. So it used to be that people really said that if women made decisions alone, that was best, that showed the most power that she had. Making decisions jointly was not as good, but not making them at all was the worst. But a lot of work now has been thinking about joint decision-making and what that means. So just in terms of thinking about how you use these variables, how you interpret the results, there's a lot of different, you want to just, they're great measures to use, but you want to think about what the particular measures you're using can actually tell you. So I want to say a little bit then specifically that there's starting to be data available that was collected specifically to measure either women's empowerment or women's agency. And sometimes they collect data from both women and men, so collect data on men's empowerment and agency as well. A lot of these measures come out of kind of a theoretical framework, often the one from Naila Kabir, where you can go back and read her and think about what she's doing, but she's really says that there's 3 dimensions that matter: resources, agency, and achievements. So the asset ownership would be one thing that fits under resources. The decision-making might fit under agency in her sense. And the achievements might be things about levels of education or what the household spends money on. The other place that the kind of a theoretical framework that this comes out of is work by Rowlands, who talks about 4 types of agency. The power to, which is the ability to enact personal goals. The power with, which is the ability to work with other people to achieve shared goals. Power within, so whether you've internalized self-respect, self-efficacy, and that you're aware of your own rights and that you can do things. And then power over, which is controlling power over someone else. All the work that I've ever done on this, communities do not like the notion of power over, and we've not included that in measure of women's empowerment. That's not seen as a good thing, at least for women, to have power over other people. There's few consistent measures across countries and relatively little data that's nationally representative. A lot of this data on women's empowerment now is project-based and collected for use in impact evaluations, but that's starting to change, and more of this is being used more widely. This is my old version of this slide. I'll get you the right one. One of the measures that's really being widely used now is the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. It's a family of indices kind of adapted to different purposes, but that are really widely used to understand women's empowerment, but also men's empowerment in agricultural development. So just in the agricultural sector, so not useful more broadly. The initial measure was designed for population-based surveys. There's now a separate version that's designed for impact evaluation, for project level things, and then just launched much more recently in the last year is the measure that comes out of these women's empowerment and agriculture indices are measures of women's empowerment for national statistics that the FAO and various other data collection organizations, the World Bank, are going to try to get this measure included in much more kind of national level household data. So that's going to start to be coming available. So these are all kinds of indices that aggregate up and try to give you some single measure of women's empowerment, but not just using the data that was already collected from other kinds of purposes, but that's really thoughtful about what kind of data do you need for understanding women's empowerment. So let me conclude to say a couple of things. One is there's lots of sex disaggregated data available. Sometimes we call it sex disaggregated data. Sometimes we call it gender disaggregated data. Those two terms get used interchangeably. Generally, when we talk about sex as compared to gender, we're thinking the sex is thinking about the biological characteristics of men and women, where gender is talking about the kind of socially constructed, what it means in a particular context to be a man or a woman, what the social norms are around that. But for economists, a lot of the data that we use is kind of the same, whether we're thinking about it either way. So those terms do get used interchangeably. We have now data panels over time for specific countries. So there's some data now that includes these measures that would help us understand how things are changing within a particular country. And there's also this data, as I've been talking about, available for multiple countries. I think one of the things that I hope you will take home from this and thinking about it is that there has been a lot of work studying this kind of data, trying to think about what are the best ways to measure it. What are the real advantages of measuring it and thinking about it in one way rather than another way? What are the strengths and weaknesses of these various measures? A lot of this kind of work has been done by microeconomists. I'm at the moment involved in a project where we're doing all kinds of field experiments, trying to understand some of these concepts. So doing surveys where we implement different ways of asking questions and seeing what kinds of answers we get and how they might differ depending on how you answer the questions. And then there's also a lot of work by economists more generally, but linking the kinds of data to the theoretical constructs. So I would just encourage you to think about using this data, use this data in your analyses, but also to know that there's a lot of work out there already that would help you to think about how to interpret it and how to use it and how to use it well. So don't just simply download it. I think that's the theme of this whole course. Don't just simply download it and plug it in, but that you do need to understand what this data is telling you and how best to use it. And I will stop there.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl, so much for that excellent presentation and an excellent overview to data on gender and how it relates to macroeconomic work. There's a number of questions. Some are specific, some are more general. And So let's see. I mean, I have a few of my own actually. It may be useful to kind of go in kind of sort of chronological order. Sushil, are you here in the, yeah, there you are. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl, for a wonderful presentation. It was really insightful. So I've worked with LSMS data before, and what I found was, maybe I'm wrong, but I wonder if men are underrepresented in LSMS compared to, let's say, like the World Development Indicator. So if I, let's say, aggregate household surveys up to the macro level, the country level, I found that, let's say, men working from the age of 25 to 40 or something like that are underrepresented in LSMS relative to WDI. So I'm worried, if I use this data to, let's say, think about sex ratios and things like that at a macro level, are you worried, or do you think, I don't know, do you have thoughts about what might be happening there?
That's a great question. I haven't thought about that one before. So there shouldn't, I don't know, I'm not sure why men would be underrepresented in the LSMS surveys in terms of kind of working. They should, the LSMS surveys, just the regular old plain vanilla variety of LSMS surveys, right? They do a household roster and collect data about everybody in the household, asking about the work that they, kind of their age, and some questions about their work. So that ought to have, right, men and women ought to be in the households kind of evenly represented. You could have particular countries where there's enough men who are not captured in household surveys, right, because they're off living in the city. They could be not living in households, but living in other kinds of things. They may have migrated out. So, right, in some places you might expect to see fewer men overall because either they've migrated out of the country and they're not being captured in the survey, or because they're not in households in the same kind of way. And so some of those men working in, kind of living in big rooming houses in the city may not be well captured by the LSMS. But I don't actually know the answer to that. So that would be my best guess given what I know about it. So
Great, thanks. Okay,
Thanks.
so I'm going to jump around a little bit then. There are a couple of questions about agricultural technologies and their gendered impacts. And I'm somehow juggling down between Q and A. And let's see. So Jemima, I don't think you're in the main group. I have to promote you. Give me just a second. So I'm gonna promote you to panelist so you can ask your question, Jemima. And then boy, there was a second one, Dennis. Let's see, let me promote Dennis. So there are two questions about, so Dennis, I'm gonna promote you to. And let me see, Jemima's gonna be rejoining. So Jemima, whenever you're ready, you can unmute and ask your questions. And then Dennis, you can do the same. Jemima, you can go ahead and ask. Thanks. Okay, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm conducting my research on gender perspective of climate smart agriculture practices and then intra-household bargaining power. So I am trying to measure the gender based on ownership of land, control, and also access to land between men-headed household and women-headed households. So my question is it a must for me to use those indices that Prof. Sherry talked about, or it's possible to just use PROSI indicators?
So I would want to sit and talk to you a little bit more about what you're specifically doing. I mean, I think for anything, right, you have to think about what the data is that you need to be able to answer your specific kinds of question. And so if you have data, right, if you have data on who owns the land or who controls the land, that's going to be useful. It's particularly useful if you're comparing male and female headed households. If you have data on women in the male headed households, do we know if any of the women in the male headed households actually own land as well, right? So that you can do an intra-household analysis. Often that's thinking about men and women within the same household. It could be women intergenerationally within the same household as well. But otherwise, it's about thinking about what you're trying to get at, and whether which kind of data, which particular variables are going to be the most important. I don't know that like the national level indicators aren't going to be particularly useful if what you're doing is looking in a particular country for that. I'm happy to follow up, if you want to contact me, I'm happy to follow up offline as well.
So just to help give some more context, because I also kind of asked her that question and she wrote a follow-up, which was think about proxies as land, ownership, management, control, assets, human capital. So these would be kind of outcomes. It may be a question that that it's easier to follow up on afterwards. So Dennis, I tried to promote you. I don't know, did you make it? It was another question about technology and agriculture.
Yeah, can you hear me?
You can.
Hi,
Yeah.
Dennis.
So I wanted to ask, like, it's just easy if you do a simple Google search that, for example, you do the gender effect on the impacts of climate, smart agriculture adoption on, for example, food security. So it's quite extensively done, I think, in East Africa. So my question is basically like, is new research needed maybe in the same locations? Because I feel like most of the questions are answered, and does it defeat the purpose for new research?
Good question. I mean, I don't think we've answered all of the questions about climate smart agriculture and gender. There has been quite a bit done on it. I mean, I think a lot of the technology adoption questions on gender, right? So let me step back. I mean, there's a couple ways to think about what people are doing, and some of it's not being done very much. Some of the work just simply asks whether men and women are adopting climate smart agriculture on their own plots of land that they're farming separately, right? That if I'm a woman farmer, what am I doing? Am I adopting climate smart agriculture on my particular land? And so there's been studies that have looked at that. I know there's been studies in East Africa that can look at that. There's also some interesting work that's kind of more recent, thinking about how women's empowerment might affect household decision making, right? And so that if women are scoring higher on these empowerment indices, then often they have more voice in the household. The assumption often is that women are more likely to care about the climate and the environment than men. I don't know that we know that that's actually true, but work that looks at how kind of these measures of empowerment, and then looking at what both farmers on their individual plots, but also, in most places in the world, people don't just farm their own plots. They do some things together, or they might have a plot that's theirs, but that, their spouse does some work on it. The men might do some of the kind of the tilling of the land for the women, and the women might do some weeding on the men's plots, right? So thinking about how some of these measures of empowerment might affect what the household is doing, I think there's scope for that as well, and there hasn't been that much of it done. So I think there are some areas where there's still work that needs to be done on this.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, many of the, most attendees in the class are students, and sometimes it's, nailing the question is is a big part of the issue. Natalia, do you want to ask your question? I can't remember whether I promoted you to panelist.
Yes, thank you
Yeah.
so much. Thank you, Professor Cheryl, for the interesting presentation. I'm a PhD student from Aix-Marseille School of Economics, and I'm working with the LSMS data from Malawi. And I have two questions for you. The first one is, how is joint ownership or joint management of land understood and practiced when the inheritance or land allocation is typically designated to a single individual, following kinships and traditional norms? And the second one is that, do you think that the respondents reporting land ownership who owns the lands, either if it's the husband or the wife, are considering when they answer the management rights too?
So your question is very specific to Malawi and what's going on in Malawi. Which LSMS data set are you using?
The panel data. Yes.
The ISA, the LSMS ISA,
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
okay. Because there's also a Malawi one of the, I think, of the LSMS Plus data where they actually interviewed all the different people in the household. So you get men's and women's reporting on land ownership, and there's actually a paper or two that's out that looks at how these things differ. Looking at the data, right, to understand what people actually mean when they say ownership is always tricky. And so whenever I present stuff on land ownership, I always have people arguing with me about it means something different in their particular kind of context. So this is a case where you've got to really go and maybe talk to people who really work in Malawi and understand the situation there. So the inheritance patterns of land are often, right, land goes to a particular person. And then whether people understand it to be jointly owned or individually owned will vary a lot. So sometimes in some places in the world, if the land is inherited by her husband, they will think about that as a piece of land that is jointly owned. And in other places, not at all. Malawi is an interesting one, right? Because you also get matrilineal inheritance, and then the men are trying to figure out if they're claiming that they jointly own the land that their wife has owned. So knowing something about how the land was acquired can be really useful in a context like Malawi. So most of the land, there's not big land markets, but the land that's purchased, to think about how the ownership and whether people are reporting joint ownership on land that they purchased rather than inherited might help to tell you some of what's going on in that particular context.
Thank you.
Yeah, the inheritance norms. As you were talking about ownership, I just kept thinking about inheritance. The Natalie Bao paper, I guess, was talking about inheritance norms and the pensions and stuff, which is another another kind of thought. Joachim, you've been waiting patiently. Do you want to ask your question? Joachim, we can't hear you actually. I at least can't hear you.
I can't hear him either.
We can't hear you. Joachim, maybe do you want to type your question and then I'll read it to Cheryl, and in the meantime, as you're typing it, I'll ask. Yeah. I'll ask a question or two. I had a number of questions that came up myself. I guess like a big picture question is a big picture issue in macro that I guess you've thought about quite a bit is female labor force participation. I mean, looking across countries and over time, there's big differences in measured market hours, and I'm kind of like the big elephant in the room for macro is this, to what extent is this just efficient dividing up of tasks and things? And to what extent is this women want to work more and there's various constraints holding them back? And I couldn't quite tell from your talk whether you were endorsing these macro, if we were to take macro studies that would try to, put some of these constraints in modeling exercises, were you endorsing those aggregate sources at the beginning? The WBL and others, or overall, you think no? Okay, so the overall answer is no.
No, is yes, that they can be quite useful for that. And in fact, I have a macro paper that uses some of those. It uses the women, business, and the law measures to try to understand what some of these things are. So if what you're doing is doing cross-country, trying to understand things across countries, those national level aggregates can be quite useful. And much easier than trying to figure out how you go and understand the legal frameworks in particular countries on your own, right? They've collated those so that they're quite easy to work with, and work really well in national level kinds of analyses.
Yeah, okay. So it is endorsement. The levels, I guess, are challenging. It depends on what model you're writing down and what questions you're asking. And then you had a comment I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on de facto versus de jure. You were asking that some of these were trying to get at the de jure component. Is your take that we pretty much have a data on the de jure kind of gender-based laws and things, or is that still an open issue for some of the people in this room and other researchers?
We have, if what you're interested in is kind of this national level question of, are these laws enforced at all, right? Or kind of given a 1 to 4, are these laws enforced? If you went to the courts to try to claim your inheritance as a woman that the law says you have, will it be enforced? I think we have it's like on a 1 to 4 scale, but I think that's pretty useful.
Okay.
And particularly useful in conjunction with thinking about whether the laws are actually in place. They're probably more useful than just thinking about whether the laws are in place. Lots and lots of countries have laws, kind of anti-discrimination laws, kind of gender equality laws, and yet whether or not they're enforced at all just varies widely. So I think those other measures are quite useful.
Yeah, Okay, so Doug is saying that there's somebody who has their hand up in the front row. That's Joachim, who we're hoping to hear from. I'm looking for your question, Joachim. And I'm not actually seeing it. Yeah, I'm not actually seeing it. So if you typed it somewhere, Joachim, I don't see it anywhere.
I think it's a direct message to me, because I was the last person to respond. Maybe I can leave the question out.
Yeah, go for it, Sushil. Thank you.
Yeah. So his question is, before ownership, how do you track the source of resources leading to the acquisition of the assets? And whether there's any formula that can be used to measure the unpaid labor done by women.
Let me answer the second one first, because that's easier. Probably the best way to measure women's unpaid labor is using time use data, where people actually report how they spend their time. The best measures, or one of the ways that is seen as being the best, is kind of 24-hour recall surveys, where you get people to either write down or recall what they've been doing in the last 24 hours, so that they're listing out both any paid work, any unpaid work. In labor force surveys, the good ones will really ask questions and be really clear that they're looking for work, not only work that's paid, but also work that's not paid. But again, part of the challenge is that there's times where women will say, oh, that's not work, right? They just don't think of it. If they're doing work around the household, maybe sweeping the house and then feeding the chickens and various other kinds of things may not perceive it as work. And so that's one of the challenges. But the time use survey data can help to do that. In terms of thinking about how people are acquiring assets, some surveys actually ask for these big items, will ask how they acquired it, and whether they inherited it, whether they purchased it themselves, whether they received it from like a local NGO. I've done this in surveys I was involved with where we were looking at livestock, right? And lots of people end up getting goats from NGOs and those kinds of things. So thinking about how there are survey questions that actually ask you how things were acquired. I don't know that there's anything very standard across countries that would help to understand the patterns of acquisition. There is some information on kind of at the household level, how the household acquired it, but not so much at the individual level that's comparable across countries.
Okay. Thanks, Joachim, for the question. Thanks, Sushil, for reading the question. Could I maybe take the liberty of asking one more? So the issue of multitasking came up early on when you were talking about measuring work. I'm assuming that the multitasking you had in mind was like childcare plus something else. Is that what you had in mind, Cheryl?
So that would be one. That's kind of that's the big one for thinking about women's work.
Yeah.
Right. And for some things, maybe it's good enough that this paper I mentioned that I've been working on, we're just using primary activities, right? And looking at work in the primary activities and thinking about which sector it's in and whether it's paid or unpaid. And that's fine, right? That's appropriate for kind of a cross-country kind of study. If you're trying to think about, for example, like women's productivity in agriculture, and you're looking at the number of hours that women work in agriculture and the number of hours that men work in agriculture, you might want to think about, and if you start saying, well, it looks like women are not as productive because for the same number of hours that they're working, they're producing less. Even if everything else is exactly the same. Well, if they've got a baby on their back that they're stopping to feed and change and do all those other things, that may be the explanation, right? And we either need to count that in or count that as what they're producing is not just agriculture, but children, healthy babies, right? So for some kinds of questions, it really matters. And for some, that primary activity is probably good enough.
Okay, right. Yeah, no, it all depends on the question. Yeah. Okay, so Hadass, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to ask a question? Time for kind of one more. You just unmute, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Prof, for your presentation and sharing your experience. I have some questions for you. One of the question is, most of the measurements you share us are more, I understand that more they are relevant for macroeconomics. Could I know if there are some of them are relevant at household or individual level measurement in order to address the gender issue? The other question is there any possibility or a room to make our unit of analysis individuals once we collect data from or at household level? These are some of the questions. These are the two questions which I need to have. I will be interested, happy if I get an answer from you. Thank you.
So I was asked, because of the nature of the course, to specifically think about gender data for macroeconomic analyses and ways of thinking about it. All of the survey data that I talked about is, right, it's at the the data that you get is at the household level. It's either at the household level or it's at the individual level. And so then you can figure out what you want to do with it. You can use it at the individual level and analyze individuals. You can analyze households. Or if you're trying to do something across countries, you can do that. So I had a paper looking at land ownership, and I was really interested in these kind of national level social legal frameworks and social institutions and various other things, and how they might affect land ownership. And normally, most of the micro studies on land ownership only look within a country. And so everybody in the country is under this, well, they're under the same national laws, right? And so you can't really compare it that way. And so what we did was we used the data from the DHS, where simple question about asking men and women whether they own land. And we used all of them, treated them all as individuals. So the data set is, I forget how many hundreds of thousands of observations. But then we put a bunch of these national level measures, including a bunch of the ones that I talked about today, in our regressions, so that we're looking at the variation within countries. Right? We've got all of the variation of individuals within countries, but are looking at how these national level factors affect it. Right. So there's all kinds of ways to mix and use together both the kind of the micro household level data with these national level kinds of measures, depending on the question that you ask.
Thank you.
Okay, we are about out of time. Cheryl, thanks again for the excellent lecture and for taking us through these Q&A. And I particularly like that we ended on a discussion of time use and household surveys about that. That's the topic for the next and final class, if I'm not mistaken. That's going to be next Friday. And it is. So Charles Gottlieb's going to take us through time use data. These two topics bookend pretty nicely. And that'll be next week and the final lecture. Thanks again, everybody, for coming, for your questions. Thanks again, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.